Hello folks, 2Edgy Blue here, and today we will be exploring a very interesting and surprising alternate history question. What if Jadwiga of Poland married William of Austria instead of Vladislav? Now that sounds pretty complicated, but let me break it down. There was once a great world superpower for its time called Poland-Lithuania. And the Polish-Lithuanian Union was formed because of the marriage of Jadwiga of Poland, the Queen of Poland, and Vladislav of Lithuania. Thus, Poland-Lithuania. Now, there was a chance, and initially, Jadwiga was actually supposed to marry William of Austria, making a Polish-Austrian commonwealth union. Now, in this timeline, Poland-Lithuania would obviously never form, leaving the Kingdom of Lithuania to be its own country, and, of course, Austro-Poland to be its own country. Now, Austro-Poland would be mainly centered around Austria because Poland would not have any coastline. It would not have any trade routes, so it would be a mainly Austrian Habsburg dynasty-centered nation. Now, in this timeline, the Teutonic Order would conquer Lithuania in the early 1400s. This is because the Teutonic Order in our timeline very much loves expansion and imperialism, and they could expand anywhere they wanted to. Also in this timeline, Austro-Poland would win the Battle of Mohawks in 1562 against the Ottomans. In our timeline, the Austro-Turkish War raged on for about 200 years, and the Turks won the Battle of Mohawks, and they slowly advanced up to Austria until they were eventually defeated by the Austrians. But in this timeline, the Austrians would declare a crusade on the Turks after they win the battle, and the Turks would almost be expelled from Europe. But this would cause ethnic minorities and Muslims from the region that would be conquered by Austro-Poland, the Balkans, to start a civil war for secession from the Austro-Poles. The Austro-Poles would win this war, though, because it is so hard to organize all these different fighting ethnic groups. This would give the Turks some time to conquer back Bulgaria and Serbia, though. In this timeline, Prussia would never form because Prussia formed out of the Teutonic Order, and since the Teutonic Order still existed, it would take its place, making it much more powerful than it ever was, instead of slowly disappearing into oblivion. In the Polish-Muscovite War, which would have been the Teutonic-Muscovite War in this timeline, because remember, the Teutonics conquered Lithuania, the Tsar in Russia would have created an alliance with Sweden, like in our history, and defeated the Teutonic Order. Now, the Teutonic Order would be strong in this timeline, but it still couldn't stand up to Sweden and Russia, that joint military force, even though Russia would be disorganized like the Holy Roman Empire. But, like Poland-Lithuania, in this timeline, the Teutonics would have conquered Moscow for a bit, but they would still be kicked out by fire like Poland-Lithuania, and eventually defeated. As a war reparation for the Teutonic Order, a Russian puppet state called the Tsardom of Lithuania would have been freed and created. Sweden and Russia would have a Cold War over Lithuania, with Swedish influence ever growing, because the Lithuanians would not like being a puppet of Russia. They had a different language and a different culture, and they saw the Tsars as unfair. In our history, the Great Northern War started because of Peter the Great's dreams of expanding westward to build ports on the Baltic Seas, to then trade with Europe. The problem was that Sweden had all the available coastline, so Russia needed to take Sweden's land. In this history, those ports would have already been located in Lithuania, causing Russia to be slightly more advanced and Sweden slightly less. The Great Northern War would have been triggered by Lithuanian revolutionaries burning a Russian port. Russia would crack down on these revolutionaries, so the Swedes would start funding them to defend against the Russians, eventually causing Russia to declare war on Sweden and causing Denmark to aid the Russians. The Teutonic Order would side with the Swedes, making the Great Northern War more evenly matched. The Teutonic Knights conquer some Danish islands and get a bit carried away and conquer the northern duchies of the Holy Roman Empire, causing them to declare war. Now, some of you may have doubts about that last one, but I can assure you they would do this. In this timeline, they would be extremely imperialist, more imperialist than they were in our history, and they would take any chance they could to conquer more land, because Lithuania had already been taken from them. Now, the Great Northern War would be more like World War I, just spiraling out of control because of a few events. Instead of being called the Great Northern War, it would be called the Great European War. Eventually, in an attempt to conquer Italy from Holy Rome, because Austro-Poland would also be very imperialistic, Austro-Poland would side with the Swedes. This would give the Ottoman Empire an opportunity for a rematch against Austro-Poland, which means they would side with the Russians. The Teutonics would be held back from going too far west by the Danes. The Danes actually had a very strong army back then. They would conclude that the war would go on forever, and they would sign a peace treaty, giving the Teutonics land in the northeastern Holy Roman Empire, and leaving the Danes fighting against the Swedes. The Swedes would go defensive until a revolution happened in Lithuania, and the Tsar of Lithuania was overthrown. Sound familiar? Yes. These revolutionaries in this timeline would be the founders of the political philosophy communism, which was created about 100 years later in our timeline by Karl Marx. The ideologically driven Lithuania would dig into Russia, effectively being able to run itself for a while. Now that sounds unlikely, but when a nation and a people are ideologically driven, it helps much more. It gives the people common ground to fight against an enemy, and Lithuania in this timeline would do just that. They would be aided by the Swedes and the Austro-Poles, who would act as their ideological grandparents. The Turks would make pushes into the Balkans, while the Austro-Poles would make pushes north into Russia, putting them in a perfect position to invade the Ottomans from the north, effectively doing a big flanking maneuver against them. This would cut off their conquest. This would be the biggest invasion of its time, but the Ottomans would be able to hold it off for long enough to enter Austria, leading to an Austro-Polish defeat. A landlocked Poland would remain intact, and declare a crusade on Vienna, which would lead to a stalemate in the Alps. With fear of invasion, which was inevitable, Poland would surrender to the Ottomans, and have to give up land to the Russians and Ottomans. Both the Teutonic Order and Communist Lithuania would invade Poland. Lithuania would start an invasion of Russia from the Polish side, leaving the only contenders in the war to be Sweden and Lithuania on one side, and Holy Rome and Russia and the Ottoman Empire on the other side. The Turks would be so far away from the war that they would just drop out of it, and eventually Moscow would be seized by Lithuania, and the Holy Roman Empire conquered by Sweden, leaving Europe in shambles. Now, this timeline has differed so much from our history that I'm going to make a part 2 to this. This was much longer and fuller than I expected, so thank you, thank my audience, remember to subscribe and like, and stay tuned.